Europe has a strange secret hidden in plain sight. It is not carved into stone, or trapped in a cave painting, or buried beneath the plains of the Danube. It is carried in blood. A recessive deletion inside a single gene on chromosome 1, the missing rhesus factor, appears today at its highest frequencies not across Europe in general, but in a sharp geographic pattern that hugs the Atlantic facade. The Basque have some of the highest Rh negative frequencies in the world. Ireland and parts of Western Britain and Scotland sit unusually high as well. The moment you draw those locations on a map, something clicks. This distribution does not look like an Iron Age tribe or a medieval kingdom or a Roman road network. It looks older, it looks like Ice Age Europe. And once you see it that way, Rh negative stops being a footnote and begins to resemble a genetic fossil, one of the few traits in living people that still whispers about glacial refugia, founder effects, and the slow repopulation of a continent after an extinction-grade climate collapse. To make that story coherent, you have to start with the original Europeans who left the first true cultural shockwave across the continent, the Cro Magnon people of the Upper Paleolithic. Cro Magnon is not a biological species label. It is an old term, a cultural shorthand, but it still captures something real. The first fully modern humans to flood into Western Europe, bringing with them the Aurignacian toolkits, symbolic behavior, art, and a demographic intensity that reshaped the human landscape. These early Europeans were not a single tribe, but a spreading tapestry of groups, moving along rivers and coasts, forming alliances and rivalries, expanding during mild interstadials and collapsing during cold snaps. Over tens of millennia, their descendants would become the Gravettians, the Solutreans, the Magdalenians, and later the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who inherited a warming world. In other words, the Cro Magnon story is not a single event. It is the opening chapter of a long Western European lineage that survives repeated bottlenecks and emerges again and again out of refugia. The Basque have a unique connection to the sea and to ancient populations of hunter-gatherers, and even Neanderthals. In fact, Cro Magnon may have originated 300,000 years ago in the Near East, and not in Africa as we have been told for decades. In fact, Cro Magnon, or the direct ancestors of Cro Magnon, are the ancestors of all Eurasians and never lived in Africa at all, according to groundbreaking new research. What's more, it turns out Neanderthals and Cro Magnon are sister lineages, and more closely related that Cro Magnon are to indigenous Africans such as the Pygmy and Bushman. Neanderthals even carried modern human blood types and mitochondrial DNA. The whole story of human origins is getting rewritten. Whatever the case, the crucial turning point is the last glacial maximum. When people say last glacial maximum, they often imagine a single moment, a date pinned on a textbook timeline. In reality, it was a long, brutal interval during which huge sections of northern Europe became lethal for long-term human settlement. Populations did not simply migrate a little south and wait it out. Many disappeared. Others fragmented into isolated demes. The continent became a patchwork of survival zones separated by ecological walls. It is in this kind of landscape that genetics behaves like wildfire. Not because selection favors some special genetic variant, but because random chance suddenly has enormous power. When communities shrink, when bands become isolated, when whole valleys become biological islands, variants can rise or fall dramatically in frequency purely through drift. The modern distribution of Rh negative, especially when it peaks in coastal isolates, fits this kind of story far better than it fits any narrative about a recent cultural migration or a single heroic people marching across Europe. This is where the Solutrean world enters, not as a romantic myth but as a real archaeological signature of Ice Age survival. Solutrean culture, centered in parts of France and Iberia, emerges roughly between 22,000 and 17,000 years ago, overlapping the severe cold of the last glacial maximum and its immediate aftermath. It is famous for an almost obsessive technical perfection. Thin bifacial points, laurel leaf forms, craftsmanship that looks like it was made by a machine even though it was shaped by hand in freezing caves. But Solutrean is more than artful stonework. It is the material shadow of a population compressed into a Western refugium, a demographic pressure cooker where isolation, skill specialization, and cultural continuity become unusually intense. If you want to imagine the type of social environment in which strange genetic patterns can be born and preserved, you could not design a better laboratory than the Franco-Cantabrian refugium of the last glacial maximum. Now look at the Basque. They are not Paleolithic frozen in time, but they are famous precisely because they retain linguistic and genetic peculiarities that suggest deep regional continuity. Their language is unrelated to Indo-European. Their genetic profile shows high frequencies of certain markers found across Atlantic Europe, and their Rh-negative frequency stands out like a flare. The Basque are often used as a proxy, not because they are unchanged, but because they seem to have absorbed less of some later homogenizing waves than other European populations. In the Ice Age refugium model, they are not a mysterious exception. They are what you would expect to exist if an ancient refugium region maintained demographic continuity through millennia. A surviving coastline population with unusually strong founder effects and a cultural boundary that helped preserve identity. The Rh-negative trait itself behaves exactly like a drift-amplified signal. Rh-negative is typically caused in Europeans by the deletion of the Rhd gene. Because it is recessive, it hides easily in heterozygotes. That matters. A variant that produces a recessive trait can lurk for a long time at low frequency, almost invisible to selection, especially if its negative effects appear mainly in specific pregnancy incompatibility contexts. Then, during a bottleneck, that variant can spike. Not because it is favored, but because the population is small enough that the genetic dice roll hard. If a small refugium population happens to have a higher starting frequency of the Rhd deletion, that frequency can become entrenched. After the climate warms, descendants of that refugium spread outward, carrying that deletion with them, and in certain edge regions the deletion remains high because the populations remain small and locally endogamous. This is the same logic behind classic founder effects in island populations. The only difference is that here the island was Ice Age Western Europe. This is why linking Rh-negative to the Solutrean is so tempting and, done carefully, so compelling. We cannot claim a Solutrean skeleton has been confirmed as Rh-negative. Ancient DNA struggles with Rhd deletion calling because the region is complex, but you do not need an explicit Solutrean Rh genotype to build a strong population history argument. All you need is the distribution pattern, the demographic logic of drift, and the known refugium corridor. Solutrean archaeology tells you where the human refugium was strongest. Basque Rh-negative tells you where drift left the deepest modern scar. The overlap is not proof, but it is a coherent fit. It is the kind of fit that makes sense of otherwise random genetic geography. From Solutrean to the next phase, the story does not become less relevant. After around 17,000 years ago, as conditions improve, Magdalenian culture spreads widely. This is the Great Re-expansion era, when Western European populations radiate out of refugia and repopulate regions that had been empty or marginal. If the Rhd deletion was enriched in the refugium populations, the Magdalenian expansion is one of the most plausible mechanisms to seed it across a wider Atlantic corridor. Then comes the Mesolithic, the era of Western hunter-gatherers, in which DNA confirms something archaeologists always suspected. There is deep continuity in the West, but also shifts. The post-glacial world is not the same as the glacial one. New contacts appear, new rivers carve new routes, new food sources allow new population densities. But the Atlantic facade remains a distinct ecological and cultural zone, with coastline mobility and sea corridors linking distant regions more effectively than forest interiors. The Irish Sea becomes, for thousands of years, not a barrier, but a genetic and cultural whirlpool, tying together Wales, Western Britain, Ireland, and later Western Scotland. That is why it matters that the Rh-negative hotspots include Ireland, Wales, and parts of Scotland. This geography is the signature of a maritime rim. It is not a continental spread pattern. It is not a Roman settlement map. It is not a medieval kingdom map. It is the edge of the map, the ocean-facing rim where population structure stays stronger and drift has a longer memory. England, especially the interior and east, becomes historically a mixing basin. Later arrivals, larger populations, more homogenization. The Atlantic edge behaves like a genetic whirlpool, retaining older signals. If you imagine the descendants of Ice Age Western Europeans creeping along coasts, living on shellfish and fish, moving in boats, trading mates across straits, forming stable regional identities that persist even through later migrations, you end up with a plausible demographic engine for why a recessive deletion could remain unusually frequent along this rim. Now add another layer that strengthens the narrative. The Basque are not the only group in Europe with unusually high Rh negative. The Atlantic fringe in general tends to run high, and that suggests the trait is not uniquely Basque, but part of a broader Western European pattern. In this view, Basque Rh negative is simply the most striking survival of a broader Ice Age phenomenon. The Basque become a spotlight, not the entire stage. The stage is the Franco-Cantabrian refugium and the Atlantic repopulation corridor. If Rh negative is an Ice Age variant, you would expect it to appear in highest frequencies, not where later Bronze Age or Iron Age migrations were strongest, but where refuge continuity was strongest. The Atlantic edge fits, the Basque fit, Ireland fits, Western Scotland fits, even the west of Britain fits. The distribution is screaming refugium drift. Cro Magnon in this framework becomes the deep starting point of the Western European lineage. The Solutrean becomes the Ice Age crucible, the Basque become the modern echo, Rh negative becomes the biological artifact. You can go further and make the argument that Western Europe experienced a kind of repeated demographic filtering, a genetic mesh. Each cold collapse reduced populations, each refugium recombined them, and each warming expansion spread a subset of variant outward. By the time the Holocene arrives, Europe is not a uniform canvas but an old book. Rh negative could represent one of those layers, a rare and recessive variant that survived when many other lineages blinked out. It may not be glamorous, it may not be linked to royal blood, but it might genuinely be old, and in genetics, old usually means powerful. None of this requires mystical claims. It requires only population structure and time. If you want to make the story even sharper, you can lean into the paradox. Rh negative can produce serious genetic problems, so why did it survive? The answer is that most individuals with one copy are unaffected, and even many Rh negative individuals reproduce successfully. The negative effect is probabilistic and context-dependent. Drift can keep such variants alive easily, especially through bottlenecks. In small populations, selection is weaker, randomness is stronger. The last glacial maximum was the ultimate machine for amplifying randomness. Solutrean Europe was not only a stone tool culture, it was a demographic bottleneck. If you are searching for a moment in history when an unusual recessive deletion could become regionally entrenched, you could not ask for a better one. So the idea that Rh negative is connected to the Solutrean is not crazy. It is simply not directly proven with a Solutrean Rh genotype. Yet as a population history hypothesis, it is elegant. Rh negative originates or becomes enriched in Ice Age Western Europe, perhaps within refugium communities that leave Solutrean material culture behind. It survives the bottleneck. It spreads along Atlantic repopulation routes. It is preserved at high frequency in edge populations such as the Basque, Ireland, and parts of Western Britain and Scotland, where drift and isolation maintain it. It is a story in which blood retains a memory longer than language, longer than kingdom borders, longer than history books. The Atlantic Rim carries a genetic fingerprint of the Ice Age, and Rh negative may be one of its clearest traces. In the end, the most unsettling possibility is also the simplest. Rh negative may not be evidence of a lost civilization. It may be evidence of something more real, that Europe's living populations still contain biological echoes of survival communities who endured the continent's worst climate catastrophe. The Solutrean was not merely a tool tradition, it was the signature of people who stayed when others could not. The Basque are not a mystery tribe. They may be one of the strongest surviving signals of that Western refugium world, and Rh negative, misunderstood as a freakish genetic trivia fact, may be a surviving marker of that entire saga, a genetic deletion that rode the Ice Age like a stowaway and still circulates today along the ocean's edge, whispering that the Atlantic was not Europe's boundary, but its refuge, its highway, and its memory. Thanks for watching.